Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Walinga, and I'm a professor of communication and culture in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University. And welcome to our webinar series, Sport, Leadership, and Social Change. In this episode, our 25th episode, but we've had many bonus reels and other episodes that have sort of tangentially connected to the core of the webinar series, but we'll call this episode 25. And we are going to be discussing media's role in fostering positive social change in sport and through sport. And my guest today for that, one of those special bonus reels is Rohit Joseph. And he's an associate producer and writer and a co-host with CBC Radio. I'll introduce Rohit in a few moments, but I always like to give a bit of a preamble to the webinar series itself and also introduce you to the work we're doing at Royal Roads. I come to you from the lands of the Lekwungen and Kusepsin people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities. We are always grateful that we too can be here in Canada, teaching, learning, living, working, and playing on their lands, unceded territories, which we are working hard to acknowledge and respect more fully than has been done in the past. Though we are not directly responsible for inflicting the harms that have been committed against our Indigenous people, we are responsible for doing the work of truth, acknowledging the truth, and then doing the work of reconciling our behaviors, systems, structures, and processes more fully with the values of respect and equity. We on the Royal Roads lands are privy to wonderful views and amazing old growth forest where we can really reflect. It's a core principle of our model and spend time thinking about the power and principles governing nature that surrounds us. And we're incredibly fortunate. We try to understand the systems and ecosystems around us and really learn from what nature's trying to tell us, and also work hard to preserve our environment. At Royal Roads, these are two of the core principles that govern our model as well. In our school, we use the bridge as a model of communication because it begins with the principles of embracing diversity and understanding the differences. So we have our tagline is to mind and then bridge the gap. So trying to understand difference before you try to build engagement or connection or some sort of relationship. And it's a core principle of our school and what we teach in terms of communication and culture. Our learning and teaching and research model really is founded upon these three concepts of applied and authentic, caring, community-based, and transformational. We believe that we really want to create life-changing experiences for everyone here in our university environment, but that really depends on willingness to transform self and understand how the learning can occur and what it takes to develop new insights and discover new ways of thinking, doing, being. That can happen most effectively, we believe, within a very caring and community-based context. And it really takes opportunities to apply what we're learning. So to pick up the tools and actually feel how they feel in your hands and apply them to your own contexts. This webinar series also reflects on this principle that we embody at Royal Roads, which is that there is truth everywhere. There's learning and education everywhere. For me, it's occurred through sport. I often count my sport career as a degree and a way that a body of knowledge and learning and understanding that I draw on regularly, even to this day. But we all invite you to also think about your endeavors and your pursuits and what truths lie within them. We value education in all its forms at Royal Roads, and we actually actively acknowledge the work that people do in their professional and community context for credit. It's part of our flexible admission policy. This webinar also highlights the power of sport, of these endeavors that human beings take part in. I often say that like art or theater or literature, sport is a true expression of humanity. And I love sport even more because of the concept of competition that it offers us. that it teaches us that competition is actually very collaborative. You need the other team, you need your opponent, and we're all working toward a shared goal of excellence, of some sort of performative excellence. It's a partnership. The webinar focuses on sport, but I find sport really reflects a lot of the core pillars of our university as well, and the things that we focus on that we believe are core principles of positive social change: the concept of education and development, diversity and inclusion, environment, equity and human rights, health, communication, and peace. And you see so many organizations within sport that have also leveraged sport to teach and support these concepts in our world as well. We have many partnerships at Royal Roads, and we work with Game Plan, which is a athlete transition program. So they move from their career in sport and into post-sport career. Often it's still in sport, but outside of being an athlete per se. We welcome in students and we acknowledge their sport background and professional experience within the sport realm for credit. But we also help them distill the learning they've gained through their professional expertise in the realm of sport and translate that into a more professional context with a career kind of mindset. We have programming that we're developing that links to all sorts of topics, but one of them, again, my favorite, is sport. We have courses in sport leadership, governance, and sport for society, the role that sport can play in fostering positive social change across society. And we have partnerships with organizations like the CFL Players Association, where we are fostering leadership development for athletes, both within their sport context, as players, as members of the team, and also beyond. So episode 25, we're focusing on media. The media's role in fostering social change in sport, but also through sport. How do they play a role in leveraging what sport has to offer the world? And so what do you believe to be the role of media regarding sport? Is it about exposure of problems, but also of great leaders and heroes and super opportunities that exist within sport? Is it about protecting the public from harm? Is it about celebrating and storytelling? What's the media's role, or all of the above? So today, my guest is Rohit Joseph, and Rohit is an associate producer with CBC Radio, and also often a co-host of All Points West. So you'll hear his voice in the afternoons. He's an avid sports fan and writer, and Rohit often reaches out and invites me to participate in conversations around some issue or event that's occurred within the sport realm, and we have lovely conversations. So I thought, what a great opportunity to invite him and to share his perspectives, because he's always interviewing everybody else. And then later on this week, we're going to have a live webinar, which involves a number of people who have different perspectives on media, both as journalists, but also as researchers of media. So Anika Terler is a safeguarding researcher and advocate, currently working on the Game Plan team. I mentioned Game Plan earlier, with a special focus on total athlete wellness at the Canadian Olympic Committee. And we'll also invite, and I love this photo of Devin. It's so Canadian, it can't be more Canadian. Devin is the host of That Curling Show, but also a cross-platform journalist for CBC Sports and News. And you've seen him covering Toronto Raptors, the US Open, Grey Cups, and of course the 2021 Olympic Games. He brought a real flavor of Canadiana, but just such joy and passion for sport in covering the recent winter and summer games. And of course, he's gone to lots of world championships as well. Donna Spencer, who comes to us from the Canadian Press, fabulous reporter, and has been doing great work in both covering sport and the sporting events. She was recently covering the Edmonton Oilers and their too soon departure from the NHL playoffs, but she's highlighted many of the issues that sport is wrestling with in Canada over the last few years. And love seeing the Canadian Press, because these wonderful journalists and reporters produce these stories, and then they're picked up by so many different media outlets. So it really has a reach across our country. And then Brian Wong, an interesting fellow who I met through the CFL leadership development course. He's not a football player. He's a hockey enthusiast and soccer enthusiast, a former soccer player, but he actually is the professional sportscaster for Chinese language radio in Canada. He's been doing that for 21 years. He works part-time with Calgary Flames and provides their Chinese broadcast. And I think his secret agenda is to try to help reach new Canadians and through the avenue of hockey and introduce them to the concept of hockey, get them playing, get them watching, get them, swirling up in the fervor around hockey in Canada. It's just such a great avenue for connection culturally. So I'll welcome in Rohit and we'll have a lovely conversation. And then we'll welcome our other guests in later next week on Thursday. We have our live webinar, and that's where we expect some audience participation as well. But this will be a teaser, the Rohit interview.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, Rohit. So great to see you in your environment. Love it. It really kicks off our whole webinar series on media. I think we'll have probably a part 2 to this one as well, because I think it's quite an important one to discuss, especially now as the whole foundation of our world is shifting all the time. So welcome. Thank you so much for spending the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Well, I thought we'd dive right in and start talking about basketball, because we have this Canada national team women are going to be playing in Victoria, our hometown. I'm going. I'm sure you're going. Can't wait. And I know you love basketball.
I do.
Quite a fan. So am I. I love the Raptors. So sad Nick's gone. But I'd love to hear more about, what do you think about some of the issues and kind of events and excitement around basketball lately? It's been a few years of fervor around basketball in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think basketball has always been a big deal in Canada, and my theory is that it's been a big deal, especially for people of color, immigrant communities, the Indigenous communities. So when the Toronto Raptors started becoming, let's be honest, like good in the last decade or so, and they just started developing this amazing culture, I think it was easy for people, especially of racialized backgrounds in Canada, the immigrant communities, because I feel like a lot of people from those backgrounds end up playing basketball at some point, just because it's the cost is next to nothing. You just need a ball and a hoop, and B, you can identify with the players a lot. I mean, the Toronto Raptors being a very international team, having players from all over the world. And again, with like a sort of similar immigrant mentality in many ways, some of them undrafted, like true underdogs, like Fred VanVleet, Pascal Siakam. I think people like that really can connect well with a lot of the communities in Canada. And I think that's helped develop and foster a great basketball culture across the country. And although it's tragic that we don't have more NBA teams and no WNBA teams, other than just the Toronto Raptors. Maybe the one positive thing is it does kind of centralize all the support and unity. And in that way, I think that's actually helped kind of increase just sort of interest in basketball. Everybody can follow one team that like everybody can kind of come together around. But in that, I feel like we've started to see just so much more talent coming out of the country. Like I can name multiple players that are at an all-star level in the NBA. I mean, you think of who's going to the finals right now, Jamal Murray. He's an incredible player. And you have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who one day I'm pretty sure could win the MVP. And there's so many others. I mean, Andrew Wiggins, who for a while was kind of a pariah of the league, seemed like, he was a sort of overrated prospect, and then he ends up becoming a huge reason that the Golden State Warriors won the championship. I just feel like we're in a really good moment for basketball. Now, I've been talking about men's basketball a lot. I have to admit my bias is that I've been mainly following the men's side of things. But looking at women's basketball too, I think the good thing about seeing this sort of success of the Toronto Raptors and people loving basketball, it's just spread to everybody, including women. I know a lot of women who follow basketball more than I think that than used to, and I think that's helped create interest in just more women wanting to play the sport, more young girls getting into basketball, and now we're just seeing so many great players at the college level too. I think that what we saw this year in March Madness, you actually kind of saw the women's basketball arguably overtaking the men's basketball in terms of the conversation. Like, as somebody who doesn't even follow college basketball much, like I'm mainly an NBA guy.
Yeah.
I ended up hearing about Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, who are these incredible women leading their teams. Caitlin Clark is being hailed as, potentially the next Steph Curry. And that's, I mean, it's not unjustified. It's in fact very justified. She's able to shoot the lights out of a gym. And Angel Reese, just her grit and determination to carry her team, LSU, to the championship eventually. It was great. But then we get into, I guess, some of the things that is also not so great about not necessarily basketball, the sport, but basketball, the media side of things. And that's where I start to sometimes worry about whether it's also just indicative of some of the issues that we're starting to see across all sports media. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious, what do you think? Like, what do you think was some of the issues that you found interesting? And I'll dive into what you think we should kind of dissect, perhaps.
Dissect, and we will. We'll dissect the Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese saga, because you and I have talked about that. We'll get there in a second. But you mentioned so many lovely things I want to dive into a little more. Like I really loved how you talked about basketball kind of growing as a cultural phenomenon within Canada. People can see it more. It's more accessible. I mean, not just because all you need is a ball, but often you can go to, there's a little school near our house, and there are, all these basketball nets, always. And often they'll actually have a net in Canada. Sometimes they don't. But there's always a rim somewhere within walking distance for a kid to be shooting hoops, right? And so, but at this school, they also just leave the basketballs outside. I mean, it's not great for the ball, but whatever, right? And I see dads picking them up, moms picking them up, kids on the weekends, through the week. So it's very accessible in that way as well, I find. There's often a pickup game somewhere. So I love that, the accessibility and the invitation, because we're a very immigrant-based country, right? So a sport that welcomes immigrants, unlike something like hockey, which isn't as open, it's more exclusive, very expensive, hey? And I'm really interested in how a sport can captivate a country. I love what you said about the central focus of the Raptors. It is helpful, kind of unified the whole country around them, didn't it? And they loved it. They loved it. Like, it felt like the whole country came out for them. So very cool. What do you think our Canadian sport values actually are? Like, you mentioned diversity, you mentioned accessibility, inclusion. What else?
That's an interesting question. I think even I guess, like, based on what I know of basketball in Canada, but also even my casual following of hockey. I'm not at all hardcore hockey follower or fan, but I just have this sense that Canadians in sport tend to represent I think, like, they're not known for being the most braggadocious, if you get what I mean. They're like, I'm gonna show by example. I will prove what I've got by example. So it's sort of like leading through action. I think that's a big part of the Canadian athlete or Canadian sports person experience, is like, I'm not going to just talk the talk. I'll more so walk the talk, and then people will be able to see what I'm about that way. I think so that's a big thing, kind of following through or executing on what you are supposed to do, and not really like talking or being more of a sort of bragging kind of personality. I think another big part of the character traits of Canadian sports is unity. Teamwork is, I think, as much more of a big deal. And I kind of noticed that just in the way that we see the Canadian athletes in the Olympics, and they're so conscientious about, this is a team effort. I got a lot of help from my coaches and from fellow trainers and my fellow colleagues. So I feel like that's a big thing. It's not as individualized. It's not as much about like, oh, this is what I can do and what I'm about. It's like, no, I got here because of my team. I got here because of the people around me. And I think that's emphasized a bit more in Canadian sports culture than it might be in let's just say American. And I don't know, maybe that's because in America, because of the sort of capital that's there, at a young age, people get introduced to, you got to be a brand and you've got to make money off it as soon as you can, which I think all the power to people that can do that and can kind of capitalize on that. But it also can kind of end up creating a sort of blown up personality. You kind of think, okay, you got a lot of yes people around you saying you're amazing, and you've got to capitalize on your brand. Whereas I feel like Canadians, because we're coming up in a place where there isn't as much capital going into sports, there isn't as much brand sponsorships right away that will just come to you if you're really good. You kind of have to work your way up, and it's usually in a team sport context that I'm talking about. So maybe that's why there's less of this sort of individualism and more of a team focus. But I don't know, maybe I'm talking without a firm grasp on this, but that's just the feel I get. What do you think?
Yeah, I love it. And you're the beginning of an empirical study.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't have any numbers to back this up. It's just sort of what I've noticed, but I don't know if there probably is some good studies into this, or sports business folks that could talk about that.
Yeah, I've just been so intrigued because it's come up a lot in conversations across our sports system with people in all different roles. But, what is Canadian sport? What are our Canadian sport values? And I love that these other things have come up, but the team. And I think we could really leverage collaboration more fully across our system as well. But you really see it with our teams. It's kind of an identity piece, isn't it? And maybe that comes coming from a colder country that's very spread out, and we have to rely on one another. But
that's a sociology study in the making, I'm sure.
Exactly. And lots of small town, right? Lots of small towns. And a lot of these people come from small towns. Connor Bedard, right? I remember watching him. The media, let's link to the media now, are really focused on him achieving a record at the Junior Worlds. And he said, people make fun of him because he barely talks, but he said something about that. I'm not even thinking about that. I'm just thinking about my team. And I thought, oh, so beautiful. Such a great representation of what you were just describing. Okay, so let's dive into the media's role now. First, again, I want to stay with what you're talking about accessibility and the immigrant experience in Canada, and feeling like they can see this sport, they can see themselves in the sport of basketball. It's a beautiful example. And women are starting to see, young girls, older girls are starting to notice that, hey, basketball is available, and they're starting to climb on board as well, more and more and more. And the media plays a huge role, because to see it, how else are they seeing it? Maybe in their neighborhood, but generally in the media. Okay. So what kind of role do you think media has been playing about giving exposure to something like the sport of basketball, but all those other qualities of it too? What do you see?
Yeah. And are we talking Canadian media, or sort of the media as in the general international media?
I think whatever you like. I think I want to hear more about your perspective working with CBC and an experience, but of course we're all influenced by all of it, aren't we? Both, so we can
absolutely.
Yeah.
First of all, I mean, I'm not in the CBC sports department, which is an interesting thing. I just end up doing stories about sports because I'm just interested in it. I mean, the funny thing is I've worked mainly in local, like CBC Vancouver, now CBC Victoria, but I, at least myself, tend to gravitate towards interesting sports stories because I think they're just interesting stories. The sports part almost is secondary. It's what I think is the most compelling about any story that has to do with athletes and sports is just the journey to get there, right? And I feel like that's what needs to be focused on. Too often, and this is a problem across all sports media, it's so much about what's the end result. Did you win? Did you not win? Okay, like if you didn't win, what can you do better to win next time? And these sort of zero sum kind of approach to the storytelling. It's there's so many interesting stories beyond did you win or not win. You know, there's so many interesting experiences and journeys to how people became the athlete in whichever sport they choose and how they got there, who helped them get there, what they had to overcome, what we can learn from that. And I think there's more movement towards those stories, but at least in terms of the mainstream sports media that unfortunately the US I think still plays a huge role in influencing.
Yes.
You still see a lot of like pundits and sports analysts sometimes I think is a generous term, but like, so you just see a lot of shouting matches about who who sort of manned up essentially. And again, it does come back to this sort of sexist gendered language. It's like they may not say it as blatantly like that anymore, but it's like, who was the bigger man, who was the tougher man, whether it's hockey, whether it's basketball, whether it's soccer. That's what a lot of sports media conversations end up boiling down to. This is, again, maybe this is my theory, this is just what I've noticed. And the reason I think that keeps happening is because it's clickbait. It's very easy to get people's attention when you see like an all caps title, Stephen A. Smith rants about Kyrie Irving or something like that, right? It's just hard to resist. I find myself clicking these things. And even if I think to myself, oh yeah, I'm just enjoying it ironically, am I really enjoying it ironically if I end up clicking on those clickbaity videos where somebody is shouting about a player who didn't live up to their expectations or who, let down the team? I think after a certain point, it's, if I'm being, self-aware here, I think I'm part of the problem when I click and consume that content, right? So I guess that's what I've noticed. I think it's even though I'm talking about an American media problem, you do see it happening in Canadian media. I mean, I'll flip the channels when I'm trying to catch a game, and you'll end up coming across content that's pretty similar. Like, you'll see the sports radio talk show that's being broadcast on TV. The Toronto Maple Leafs yet again didn't live up to expectations, and it's like, all right, like, can we just get beyond these same old tropes? That's almost, it's just exhausting to see the same old tropes being trotted out, and they're kind of, it's lazy journalism, it's lazy, I think it's lazy narratives that we kind of fall back to because they appeal to our base emotions. So I think sports media has a ways to go in terms of telling really compelling stories about the athletes, about the sports, that go beyond sort of, did this person do what they were supposed to do? and perhaps we do see, like, I do think some of my CBC colleagues in CBC Sports are really doing their best to tell those stories. Whenever we do syndication interviews with folks like Anastasia Busis, we get the story about who this athlete is, why we should watch out for this person, what was their come up, and we're hearing that more often, but is it getting necessarily the attention it deserves? That's a tricky question.
But I love how you're touching on this recursive relationship between the consumer and the reporter, right? Or the media and the consumer. And lazy maybe lazy reporting, but also very fatigued, or probably lazy consumers too, right? Just kind of clicking, la, 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 and not really thinking critically about what they're clicking on, because that is, of course, just fostering the whole cycle. But there's a great example with Anastasia's Player's Own Voice, a wonderful effort. And I like seeing that it's sustained. It hasn't just disappeared. Really thrilled when it happened. I thought that was great leadership by CBC. But my question, I used to teach kids, my question to them was always, so who starts it, chicken or egg? Is it the media that's leading the consumers, or the consumers are leading? And it is iterative and interactive, but the either one could stop clicking, right? But the media, what could the media do differently to shift or intellectualize, or more, make the narratives more complex and useful to society?
I think in terms of what media can do, I think one of the things that is a good principle to have is, how can I be inclusive with this story? If I had to tell this story about a particular sport and a particular player or athlete, how would I tell it so that whether it's my grandma who has no idea about this sport, or a little kid who is just learning about their interest in sports, how do I get to include all of them in the conversation, and not like I'm just writing this for that specific audience that's already tuned into, let's say, hockey or basketball. I want to write a story that would draw any listener, any reader, any consumer, because the story itself is a compelling narrative, right? And I think, like, when I try to explain like what I love about basketball, it's the storylines, it's the interesting, human aspects of a player's journey getting to the NBA, or how they're navigating a tough personal crisis in their life and have turned that into something that helps them actually become a better player. Let's actually dive into the Black Lives Matter moment, really, that really became the focus point of everything in 2020. In the middle of a pandemic, we saw a huge moment for Black Lives Matter, and players standing up for civil rights, and just, they were like, there's so much more to me than being an athlete and a basketball player. It really happened especially in the NBA, because of, so many players, I think, not only being African American, but also they themselves having a bit more agency compared to other sports leagues. It's other sports leagues. It's fair to say that, they were able to come together and sort of make statements, or just kind of demand certain things of the league, and then that kind of influenced other sports and other people to do the same. And I think that's an example of where we, as the media, had to react to that. Like, I was, I'll give you an example, actually, because when George Floyd died, in such a horrific way, I ended up seeing and hearing about it more from basketball players than I did initially from, like, even Canadian media. It was to such a point where I'm like, okay, this is really affecting so many people in so many different worlds, and that's when I was like, I like pitched it at that time when George Floyd died, and there was not I hate to say, there was a sort of almost like, this happens a lot in the US. What makes this situation different? But it was the way that it was filmed and captured, and it was just so blatant. And then when basketball players made their voice heard about it and tried to get everybody to know, no, listen, you got to see this, you have to watch this. It made me, even as somebody who, I almost hate to say this and admit it, but like was almost desensitized to the sort of violence, police violence and racism. But LeBron James making a statement on it on Instagram, and just making people more aware, like including myself, that made me then pitch a story about it in Victoria, and saying, I know this is happening in the United States, but I think this is affecting a lot of people. And if someone like LeBron James is posting about this, it means we should pay attention. And we ended up doing a story about the NBA players making a stand. We had a young basketball player here. We had a Black American who actually lives in Victoria and does basketball coaching and training also join our show to like do a panel discussion about what's happening, why it's important that we're seeing NBA players in 2020 making their voices heard and making a stand. Even though it's seemingly a political issue, they decided no, we had to go beyond the so-called "shut up and dribble" narrative that was being, for a long time, I think, being imposed on athletes. Like, you can't talk about that. That's not in your realm. But in reality, we've seen athletes take a stand, since the beginning of the 20th century, and we've seen athletes like Muhammad Ali making their voices heard. So it's really just a continuation, right? But I think that was a good example of we had to, as the entire media community had to respond to that and had to follow those stories. But we have to like learn those lessons from what happened in 2020 and actually stick with it. Keep trying to find those stories. Keep trying to shine a light on those stories where we're going beyond just the sport itself to tell a story that's universal.
And the athletes are recognizing that they have a platform and becoming more savvy and engaging the media around the issues. And we see it with Canada and the safe sport crisis, right? It's just exploding. And anytime I speak to a journalist about it, they're like, oh yeah, we're listening to the athletes. They're the ones that people in the community want to listen to as well. So they have such a connection to the community, but also they're really understanding that they have this wonderful platform and they're using it. I love it. Great to see. Now, so it's both, right? But I think that the consumer, but also the actual athletes who are the performers, they are the ones really driving a lot of the stories that are, and insisting on these kinds of far-reaching stories. And they don't always have to be, incredibly emotional and dramatic, right? They can also be the fun. I'm seeing a lot of that where we're getting to know these athletes as fun, and they're reminding us that sport is supposed to be really fun. Let's talk now. Let's shift into, and Giannis at Tacumbo, right? He was a great example of where we had to listen to his message, and it's not about talking about winning or losing or failing or succeeding.
Yes.
It's about much more, and that was gorgeous too. You and I had a good chat about that. But let's talk about Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark. That unfolded in a very interesting way. I was down in San Diego, so I was in the US, and I was hearing a lot of people talking about Caitlin and no one talking about Angel, first of all, was my impression. And then, of course,
I think that's a fair impression, by the way. I think that's a very fair impression.
So why are we all talking about Caitlin? Because we're hearing it mostly from the media, right? And sure, she is like a Steph Curry. She does shoot the lights out, but so does Angel Reese, and so do a lot of the athletes within the two teams that end up in the final. So talk to me a little bit about that. What were your impressions of how the saga unfolded? What were some of the things you noticed occurring in the media and in the population?
Yeah, well, at least from what I noticed, Caitlin Clark, like you said, got a lot of attention. I mean, she was showing up on a lot of ESPN highlights and being talked about in the NBA talk shows as well. So that immediately drew my attention. Like, oh, I should be paying attention to Caitlin Clark. And interestingly enough, Angel Reese, I started seeing from more so, to be honest, like Instagram pages of Black NBA athletes who were saying, like Angel Reese is somebody we should also be paying attention to. And Angel Reese had a really engaging social media presence where she was also, I think, one of several college players, women basketball players who were talking about, like, I don't know why these brands don't come up to me when it comes to like having flawless makeup and still being able to look good while playing basketball. Like, I think I'd be a pretty good candidate for that. She did like a very cheeky and fun post about that. And it was brilliant. I thought it was like really showing her personality, who she is. She has so much self-confidence, which is just great to see. And so I thought both of them were engaging personalities, but one got a bit more attention. And I think whether it's men or women's basketball, when there's a white player that is good, then it's like, oh, look at this white player who like is managing to still stand out in a black dominated league, So I think inevitably and unfortunately you kind of see it's almost like, oh, the sports media, since it's very, I think, white to say the least, will gravitate towards those stories. And again, Caitlin Clark, to her credit, deserved a lot of coverage, but I think that's my theory as to why maybe Caitlin Clark got more compared to Angel Reese, who's also extremely talented, a great personality, and just as engaging of a story. And then when they finally do meet up for the final, that's when I think things got a little toxic, to say the least, because part of any sport is chirping between players and sort of taunting, and when it's done in a way that isn't extremely personal, it's usually just fine. And I think between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, like, I didn't see anything that was personal or crossing a line. But when I think Angel Reese did, was it like the "you can't see me" kind of I don't know, there was a sort of, she basically mocked a taunt that Caitlin Clark would do when their team was up, and then you just saw all these sports commentators going nuts, like, oh, that was classless, oh, how could she do that? And some people were really mean to Angel Reese, saying things that I'm not going to repeat here. And I just thought, how did this go from an engaging, genuine, like, rivalry that was just fun and cool, and I think that was showing the best aspects of women's basketball, and then it turned into this unfortunate, like, toxic dialogue, again, just so literally black and white, figuratively and literally black and white, like, oh, how could that black woman player say these horrible things about this white woman player? And it's like, she didn't even say anything, she just did like a taunt, which was the same taunt that Caitlin Clark would do when she was having a good game. And that happens all the time in sports. People, like, it's part of the fun, it's part of the the sort of engaging aspect that we like to see players have a little combativeness to them, and kind of chirp each other and maybe imitate each other when it's like when the game is just close and intense like that. And it's like, I don't know. I think that's where I was disappointed to see it devolve, that dialogue, instead of just being like, look, I mean, what you possibly had in your hands. And I think when Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese go into the WNBA, it could be like Magic and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. Like, it could be that level of, whoa, this is a cool rivalry. And I guess that rivalry also got toxic in the media of that time, but I'm just saying, like, it didn't need to be something that's so ended up becoming this conflict that I don't think the players themselves had. In fact, Caitlin Clark was like, I had no problems with what Angel Reese did, and that's just part of the game. She literally said there was no issue, so people made an issue out of a non-issue.
And partly, like you say, it's clickbait, it's a conflict, so it's exciting. You want to see the kind of intensity of it, but why it was very racially driven. That was pretty obvious. And so,
yeah,
it's fine to focus in on rivalries and even conflicts, or when some sort of a fight even breaks out, it kind of makes sense. People want to watch that or see that or know about that. But yeah, this one was framed in such a creepy way and very disappointing. And hopefully, it doesn't turn into more or have lasting impact. I worry about the lasting impact on the players who experience, because it went beyond Angel and Caitlin, who were experiencing this framing of the story that was so destructive. Yeah, what do you think could have helped prevent that? I mean, you're a producer. What could have helped shift that slightly? Or
yeah, I guess if you're coming from a media angle, if you're coming from the journalistic angle, it it's producers not kind of succumbing to the controversy machine, because I do think it's easy to jump on that as a producer, like, oh, look, there's controversy there. That's gonna get a lot of attention, and let's hyper focus on the I guess the conflict aspect, rather than you know, actually interviewing each of those players and hearing from themselves, like, hey, what did you think of the intense competition you had with Caitlin, like asking Angel about that, or vice versa, asking Caitlin about that before just harping on the controversy. I think how you frame a story is so important. And if I think the choice was made to deliberately harp on the controversy without checking in with the players, without checking in with the teams. And that was an unfortunate choice that didn't need to be made. It could have been different. It could have been um but maybe if it was more wholesome, it wouldn't have got as much attention. So this is the other thing. Is there a sort of weirdly positive benefit that more attention got put onto the women's basketball game as a result of the controversy? That's a
But
twisted.
in the same old way as catty women, right? So it still perpetuated that narrative, a very sexist narrative. But
Yeah.
it seems too to me that there was some judgment, and that contradicts the role of the media, to be curious, like you were suggesting. Like, let's be curious and reveal it and tell the story. That's our job, not to bring in all sorts of judgment necessarily. So let's go there a little more. What is the role of media? You know, you have a really great insight, lots of experience into what goes into deciding on the story, but also what kind of drivers are there for focusing on certain aspects of a story because they'll garner attention. Like, obviously you want to engage the community, but
Mhm.
you know, not just for financial reasons, but you want to engage them. That's your role as well, and keep them informed. And it's this two-way street. But are there drivers that you hear a lot within your context that are telling you, you know, focus in on that? That's going to get us lots of attention.
Yeah. I will say, people, even my friends ask, like, oh, are there people that are asking you to cover certain things and not cover other things? And no, there isn't that. And again, I can just speak from the CBC Victoria context, which, working in CBC Victoria, we're mainly covering things that happen on Vancouver Island,
Yeah.
and things that might affect Vancouver Islanders. But I take the approach of things that are happening, even if they're not on Vancouver Island, can affect people that are here, right? Things are happening around the world. We're a very globalized society. So I tend to try and do stories where the global is local and the local is global. There's universal stories to be told. And that's why I've justified like pitching stories about, certain things happening with athletes in America or internationally, and why we have to talk about that, even if the athlete themselves isn't Canadian. I mean, that's how I managed to get that story where I got you on our show talking about Giannis Antetokounmpo, because the compelling story that I at least pitched to my boss was, hey, this is about the universal aspect of how we treat failure. And it happens to be coming from an athlete who had to respond to a sports reporter question. By the way, it does turn out that reporter had a great relationship with Giannis, and that's probably why we were able to get the response we got from Giannis in that moment, where he was so open and vulnerable, saying that there isn't failure in sports, and here's why. It's steps to success. And just when I told my boss about that universal aspect, she was like, "Yeah, that does sound interesting. Let's make it happen." And I have to say, that's where it also makes a big difference. Having leaders in my field who are open to these kind of things, who are open to pitches that are about stories that really are about these universal things, not just. I mean, she could have also just said, no, that really has nothing to do with Victoria or Vancouver Island. Like, nah, let's not do it. And she would have been justified in making that choice. But she saw what I was what I was thinking would be a compelling thing. And it did help that I knew of you, Jennifer, as somebody who would be able to comment on this, like having the ability to say, hey, this is happening there, but we have people here who do care about that and are responding to that. And that was just my guess. I just guessed. I didn't write an email to you until I got the approval to go ahead and chase that story, right? So in my opinion, what makes a huge difference in what gets covered and what doesn't get covered is having open-minded leaders in the newsroom, people who are all about inclusivity and in a genuine sense that, okay, if we're going to tell that story about said topic, let's say it's a, like a basketball or hockey story, how do we include other people? And I, as a reporter, as a radio producer, have to make that pitch and say, well, this is how we can include everybody in on this story. This is how we draw people who have no interest in that sport into this story. And, I got good feedback from that interview, even though there were people listening that they were like, yeah, I don't follow basketball. I had no idea, but they told me like, it was really cool to hear that. And I'm glad, that got told. And that really is a validating thing. So I feel like that's the kind of environment where you get better stories. When you have open-minded leaders, leaders who emphasize, okay, whatever story we're telling, how do we include everybody so that they can get something out of this? They get value out of hearing it. And I think those are just the two simple things, really. That's all. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
Love it. Yeah, that responsibility to the public, the whole public, and being really conscious of who that public is, the whole community, what might be. And it sounds to me like you are very values-based, and the leaders need to be values-based too, thinking about what will actually help them to know about, or be inspiring, or be useful to them, or educational. There does seem to be an increasing, especially through the sport lens, a shift. You see Westhead and Katie Strang doing such great work of elucidating, educating the public on the issues, but also kind of pointing to avenues we need to be heading in sport so that it is more inclusive, less discriminatory, safer, and more joyful, and more about what we value. Yeah.
Mm.
Why are you involved in media?
Oh man, I get so much joy out of learning about people and what makes them tick, and then sharing the sort of stories and lessons that everybody else can learn from those people, and I guess what I love the most about my job is like there's no every day is different. There's no like predictability in that sense. Like, I every day I can end up being assigned a different story or being able to pitch a different story that I think is interesting. And I'm in the daily, mix of news and current affairs. But lately I've been given the privilege to work on projects that are about things like, the model minority myth on Asian Canadians and how, that's affecting Asian Canadians. I'm able to work on climate change reporting. I guess this is the thing. I have a lot of interests, and this job that I'm lucky enough to do lets me explore all those interests and talk to a lot of cool, interesting people like you, and like many academics, many regular people. And I think that's just the thing. If you're curious about people and you want to hear their stories, this is the job for you. And sometimes it can feel like a grind because sometimes you do have to respond to what is the biggest political news of the day. Like, that is important, and we need to inform people on that. But if you're like me and you take the opportunity, even working on a daily current affairs show, you can make your own opportunities if you can just basically sell people on the idea of, hey, I want to do a project on this, and here's why I think it'll resonate with a lot of people. And usually I think we're in a good space, at least in CBC, where we're really trying to I think out of necessity, appeal to more types of people, appeal to different demographics. I mean, the way things are going with traditional mainstream media, it's like we have to do this. We have to be adaptive and we have to expand the types of stories we tell, because otherwise, we won't be as relevant anymore. And I think that sort of necessity that environment has created has kind of led to, at least to my benefit, which is, all right, yeah, you have an idea to explore Asian Canadians who are subverting stereotypes that have affected them. Sure, let's hear it. Let's make a space for that on a holiday show, or if it's a pitch about an athlete story, a basketball story that I'm interested in, that it's like, yeah, that does sound like a story that a lot of people would care about. Not all of our listeners, maybe not the traditional listeners that we have, but we're only going to get more listeners. We're only going to get more types of people if we expand beyond what we consider the traditional listeners, right? So that's what I love about my job, is that it's a challenging one. It's definitely changing all the time. There's definitely ups and downs in terms of the days and how they go, but so many times I get to meet and learn from really cool and interesting people, and that's why I love what I do.
You exude that, and you really pitch the whole role, I think, too. We have a lot of learners in our university who are in the realm of communications who would be looking to hear about career opportunities for sure. But it does sound just like such a vibrant, there's autonomy, there's flexibility, creativity, connection with others, and very, again, so socially really grounded. Wonderful. And thank you so much for spending the time. Do you have anything else you want to share on this topic of media in sport, through sport, for sport? Any other comments to make?
Well, just on that, just picking up on the point you just said about, I think it's so important to just get more types of people doing sports reporting, doing sports media, because, if anything, what I learned is, like, it doesn't need to just be like former athletes or former coaches, or because in some ways, of course, it makes sense that those would be excellent sports reporters. But traditionally, there's a lot of sports reporters who have no background in that. And, some of them are great, some of them not so great. But what I would say is, like, what's more important, I think, is if you're into sports, you just love any sport, or you have a particular love for one, whatever it may be, if you're into it and you think, like, you have the interest in exploring more stories about that and you want to learn more, if you're curious about that, I think you should do it. And that's all there is to it. And we need people from diverse backgrounds, and I don't mean just ethnicity. I mean of different socioeconomic classes, whether you're working class or upper class, whether you're a person with disabilities. I think that would also be great to get more people in sports media that are actually people with lived experience of disability and can talk about that, and can, like, interview athletes about that, because I mean that's something that doesn't get probably covered enough, right? And so I just think we have to make it appealing to more types of people. And in order to do that, we just have to say, hey, you're welcome in to tell the stories you want to tell, to explore the things that you want to learn about. What do you find interesting? There's a good chance that others will too. So if there's people who are watching this and listening to this, please try to consider a career in media. And you don't have to go through the mainstream media anymore. You can just start it off as your own YouTube channel. You could start it off as, a TikTok or Instagram reel sort of way of delivering your own stories, what you find interesting. And I think personally, that's actually what I've been noticing. The new wave of sports storytellers are going to be coming from places like YouTube. I can already see it. I mean, and I think that's something that people can learn from and realize, like, hey, I don't have to do it like the sort of old school way of going to a journalism school and then trying to enter the industry through an internship. You could just make your own path. If you can start putting up content, which at first will probably, let's be honest, not be good, but that's okay. You'll get better and you'll learn, and you just make the effort to try and reach out um, to teams like in your own community. You could do it at a local level and then go from there. Eventually, get to the national leagues or international leagues that you are really interested in. But if you can cover sports in your local community in a compelling way, I mean, chances are you'll be able to get access way more easily. That's a good place to start, right? So yeah, I just want to encourage people who are into sports and into storytelling to go for it.
I love it. Thanks so much. What a treat to spend this time with you, Rohit, always. And really appreciate everything you had to say. Just so insightful, lots of great advice, super thoughtful. You know, you can see that you're really thinking about what to share, about all the people. And what I drilled down to through our whole experience together is kind of came full circle back to the importance of diversity, right? Such an important, crucial element. I was chatting with a buddy, Nick Hopewell. He teaches sport law over at Capilano, but he and I were just reflecting on why does our world struggle so much with the concept of diversity? That's why I love sports so much, because it really does highlight the power of diversity. And why I want to just make sure we preserve sport for that reason. But it's the key, you know, how can we not see it? It's all around us, working very effectively in nature.
Yeah.
And we know teams hinge on it, right?
Absolutely. And I think that just applies to everything, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of people's backgrounds, like whatever it be. You know, the cliche. It sounds cliche because we just keep hearing it, but there's truth in diversity. Makes us stronger. It makes us better. It makes us better informed. You know, so and it's just more compelling. It's just as a storyteller, you know, getting those diversity of perspectives and thoughts, and that's just where you find more interest, at least for me. So I'm glad we're on the same page about it. I hope I hope people get something out of this. You know, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on any particular thing, but because I'm sort of interested in a lot of things, I end up getting a little bit of knowledge from a bunch of different places. So just tried to share a bit of that here.
Well, a captivating conversation, and you've shone the light on a lot of important topics today. So thank you again. And I'll sign off there, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.